welcome back and to the series on mapping the shadow. Now we're moving to a very important but difficult subject, and that is around evil and morality. So, as I've explained at various points in this series, the discussion of evil is one of the most ironic, actually, in many ways, because it's firstly one of the most important, but secondly, one of the hardest to understand. At the same time, we have a conscious obliviousness, largely, to what evil is. There's certainly very little cultural understanding of what evil actually is. Even goes so far as maybe even to denying the existence of evil, rendering it as just, it's just that which gets in the way of what I want, or such like. And at the same time, we have a deep, deep archetypal understanding of exactly what evil is. If you have kids, or if you remember being a kid, maybe you are a kid, precocious, but okay. You've certainly seen these cartoons, right, of these dark and slithering characters that even a 3-year-old child can immediately recognize at least what it represents. They might not be able to articulate it. They might be able to say, oh, he's the bad guy or something, but there might not be that nuanced understanding of what that is. Okay, so someone turns up to a fancy dress party wearing a vampire outfit, and suddenly the kid is scared. God knows what they're doing there, but okay, they can't tell the difference. So there might be a lack of nuance there, but that doesn't mean there isn't an understanding. There is most certainly a deep understanding of what evil is at the unconscious level, which suggests that it has some kind of reality, and there's a level of understanding that we can all share. But I think one reason this is so unintuitive is because it's so hard to define. It's both very, very important to understand, and at the same time very, very hard to understand. And there might be no subject other than evil and morality that is subject to such a wide differential between importance on one hand and the widespread lack of understanding on the other. This should give us some clues as to the direction that this is all headed. The understanding of shadow work, what it's really about. Jung certainly talks about evil. He didn't try to define evil exactly. Some of the thinkers which preceded him certainly did. So we're going to be looking at the works of Schelling and other German idealists, and even Kant as well. But he certainly understood and made the point that evil is not merely a privation of good. It's not merely the absence of good. It's not merely the absence of, like, the shadow as a term seems to imply the absence of light. But we know from the shadow map that the shadow is far more than a mere absence of anything. It is an active, energetic force. And subsequent Jungian thinkers like Marie-Louise von Franz, like modern day Murray Stein, James Hollis, naturally have all talked about evil, had to talk about evil. And yet at the same time, we're led to believe that you have no faculties with which to make any assessment as to the moral integrity of those around you, of the world around you. You're just projecting. Hey, so no, we need to go a lot further than this, because the understanding of evil is not only part of shadow work. I'd make the case it's actually one of the final endpoints of shadow work, like truly understanding the difference, not just intellectually, but experientially as well, and intellectually and philosophically, the difference between evil and good. And I don't mean good in the sense of like just pleasant or nice, or what we normally think of as good. That might be the conscious thesis over here. I mean the very essence of good itself. And so there's all kinds of arguments against the existence of God, and if God is so powerful and benevolent and omniscient, why does evil exist? I mean, that's just easy, right? It's because evil is contained within good. That's why. Because existence is all the better, not partly because it contains evil, but also by virtue of the freedom that allows evil to exist. It's not necessarily that evil is like a desirable thing, although it can serve a teleology. So we have to be very, very, very precise with our thinking and understanding here, because there's kind of a good to evil, kinda, right? And we're very careful here, but there is something about it. And this is not to endorse it or to say we ought to be going around doing it. That's something very different. So it's a very hard thing to articulate, but I'm going to do my best. But the reason for that is that it's not about the articulation, it's about what it does for you when you reflect on these ideas. What it does to your own mind. That's the whole point of this, right? This model, it's just a map, it's just a model. What does it mean for you? So let's go then to this quote from Jung that I just displayed. He said that everything that becomes too old becomes evil. The same is true of your highest. What on earth does this mean? Everything that becomes too old becomes evil. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean that if you become old or if you are old, that necessarily means you're evil. No. What he means is that any idea that becomes outmoded necessarily becomes evil. So looking at the shadow map, for example, let's take an example here like mercy and severity. So severity as opposed to mercy, like sternness and this sort of fatherly masculine energy that needs things to adhere to a certain structure or to adhere to what's known and to go forth, make things happen, and to impose certain rules perhaps within reason for a certain time. But hey, what happens to rules and regulations when they persist and become old? Or when they become insisted upon to a great extent? Well, they become cruel. It becomes cruelty. It's like abuse in the name of law and order. It becomes very, very cruel. Same can be said about mercy. You take mercy to its extreme, it becomes a kind of passivity. And that can be a kind of evil. So what Jung is saying is not about like age in itself, hopefully that's pretty clear, but about the fit of the current thesis or the current system or the world's institutions to the needs of the moment. Everything becomes old eventually, and beyond a certain point, if it doesn't keep with what it needs, it becomes evil by necessity because it starts to insist upon itself at the expense of truth. And as he says here, the same is true of your highest. So bear in mind, he wrote this in the Red Book, so this is over 100 years ago that he's writing this. And so not from a modern day perspective exactly, but from the perspective of like virtue. Like Jung was quite simply saying that be careful of being virtuous, believing that you're virtuous. And what you think is your greatest virtue has a kind of evil, and certainly can become evil and will become evil if you're not aware of that. Simple as that. So again, this is just pointing to what in the past I've termed the duality of duality. In other words, not only is the mind dual, not only is existence and everything in existence dual, but that duality itself is dual. So the way we like to show up, whether that's our persona or even something maybe more developed, like maybe not necessarily what we did when we were 15, 16, 20, but maybe you're in your 50s or 60s and you still have a kind of persona. It may be more mature than what you had as a young person, but it still too has a dark side, because every partial idea must encounter negation. It must fall short of the truth that it represents ultimately. So just as the persona has a dark side, the persona is dual, the shadow is also dual. It too is partial. And that means that it contains aspects of truth and aspects of falsity. It has a wholesome aspect and an unwholesome aspect. And therefore, even the darkest shadow contains elements of what you actually need in order to develop into your full implicit potential. So, making that point clear from the get-go, starting to develop a very basic understanding perhaps of what evil actually is. Immanuel Kant, who was a great influence on Jung, said that this is known as Kant's categorical imperative. He said that act only according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So in other words, no exceptions. Another way of thinking about this is the means are the ends. There are no ethical means to ends. If we believe we have to violate someone else in order to get what we want and that will be a good thing, then we've actually contradicted ourselves there, because we've actually elevated our own need for freedom above someone else's, which is a self-contradiction, and it can't play out indefinitely. So on one hand, what Kant is saying here, sort of, hopefully you agree, seems to make some sense, right? It's that if my behavior here, this action or this law or this cultural piece in society, if you stretch that to infinity, could it produce good things? Is it sound enough to become a universal law? So there's wisdom in that, clearly, but it also contains another problem, because even though this statement from Kant speaks about universals, it also contains an absolute, right? It contains a kind of one-sidedness of its own. And so many thinkers pulled this apart and criticized it, accused him of trying to drag people back to religion, or a sort of absolutist, thou shalt not type approach to morality. But if we actually give Kant a bit more flexibility here, maybe what he's trying to do is account for universality within this. So you take any law, any behavior, and stretch it to infinity, as we've said, it becomes a problem. Not only that, it can become evil. But what if we can account for that itself? What if we understand that? What if that same principle applies to this very statement? Right? In other words, if you take this statement to its extreme, it falls down just like any other. But at least it accounts for that within itself. It maybe understands that a little bit. And so subsequent thinkers like Schelling, like Hegel, worked with this further. Let's next go to a quote from Friedrich Schelling. So here he's now talking about the difference between what the previous guys have been saying. So like Jung talking about particularity and taking an idea to its maximum development, and in his previous quote here talking about how anything that becomes old becomes evil. Schelling takes it to the next, even though Schelling was actually earlier, he actually gives us the next bit of information we need to understand the difference. And he says here that aroused selfhood is not evil in itself, but only to the extent that it has completely torn itself away from its opposite, the light or the universal will. This actually could not be any clearer. So I find a very powerful, concise quote from Schelling. Selfhood in itself is not evil. Now, you take this to an Eastern tradition, and you might get an interesting reaction, because in things like Buddhism, often this idea of selfhood is a bit of a dirty word, and almost to the point where the idea of no self is elevated above morality itself. But this actually tacitly reveals the order of priorities there, because selfhood and morality are not the same thing. They're actually two quite different things. In fact, you need selfhood for morality to even exist. And if you conflate the two, you end up throwing out a real understanding of morality, believing that selfhood itself is evil just because it's particular, just because it's limited, just because it's alienated to an extent from God or from spirit. But that's all part of the journey, that's all part of the process. So as Schelling is saying here, it's not selfhood in itself, but only and when it uses its freedom of selfhood to tear itself away, which is an impossible task in the end, because we all depend on the same processes, conditions from which we have come from. But the attempt, because we all have the freedom to attempt to do that, to tear itself away from its opposite, from the light, from the universal will, that is evil, according to Schelling. So in other words, using freedom to violate freedom. And this makes a lot of sense. We're going to be talking more about freedom in a few episodes' time. But for now, just try and see that that makes perfect sense, because even when freedom is being used to violate freedom, it's still freedom. It's still using freedom to do so. Freedom is what there is, ultimately. So that means, by necessity, that we each have the freedom to violate freedom. And what this means is that evil is actually a violation of that natural, rational order. Evil is therefore an insistence on something that does not make sense. It wants to exist in a universe that couldn't exist. It wants to violate the very thing it needs to even exist in the first place. That's what makes it evil. But it must exist because there's the freedom to do it. And there can't not be. In fact, Schelling also elaborates on this in this quote. He says that the general possibility of evil consists in the fact that man, instead of making his selfhood into the basis, the instrument, could strive to elevate it into the ruling and total will. So in other words, evil is the attempt to bend the everything to the particular, to make the particular what there is, to take the absolute and say, yeah, that all exists for me, right? Back to the shadow map. It's pretty clear. You can see this easily. In fact, I'm just going to go straight to my model of this. I was going to say that for the next episode, but I think it's relevant now. I have a concept called dissonance loops. So basically, it's where the power position or the shadow position becomes insistent upon itself to such an extent that it completely denies any transformation whatsoever. And so it becomes completely dissonant and self-contradictory. It insists on its own existence and through complete lack of empathy refuses any transformation whatsoever. So this is a concept I call the dissonance loop. And it's a very important one to understand. I've saved it to this relatively late stage in the series because it's a little harder to understand and it builds on everything else. But we're going to be getting to this again in the next episode here. But in terms of a visual, this is what Schelling is talking about. He's saying that the particular, you might think of it as the ego or anything, it could be any idea, right, is now deeming itself the new centrum, the basis of selfhood. So instead of making his selfhood into the basis for self-realization, he wants to elevate it into the ruling and total will, just like in his last quote, talking about how selfhood becomes evil when it tears itself away. So let's look at some examples of how this might actually show up. Now, you'll be quite familiar with many of these already, so let's choose some new ones here. Okay, let's look at this one. Fairness. Fairness is a great idea, right? But what happens when you take the idea of fairness? Imagine if fairness itself being a kind of self, well, a thesis, a particular. And it's certainly part of the self, and there's certainly value in it, and there's certainly a godliness to fairness. But what happens when that fairness turns its back on the universal will? At some extreme, you might consider that total equity. Now, of course, there's nothing fair about total equity. We already know that extremes become their opposites. So total equity actually becomes a kind of unfairness immediately. And you take it to its extreme peak, like the peak power of fairness is a single moment before peak irony. And there's no shortage of examples of this in our modern world at our moment in time, where the idea of fairness taken to its extreme has become completely self-contradictory and hypocritical. So I've often thought that actually hypocrisy might be not only the ultimate sin, but the fundamental sin. It is the basis of all sin because it's self-contradictory. That's exactly what Schelling is referring to. It's self-contradictory because it wants to make itself the basis of everything, falls in love with its idea of itself, refuses to engage with anything else, and therefore does precisely to others what it does not want to happen to itself. And it cannot separate itself from the whole, and therefore it proves itself through sheer irony what it's really packing, what it's really hiding. So even though fairness taken to its absolute extreme can show up as total equity, the desire for equity of sorts in itself is not necessarily evil. But it's when it becomes completely one-sided, or that too, okay, one-sidedness can sort of be forgiven as well. But that's different from evil. Remember I talked about quantity, quality, and direction. So you've got the quality of fairness. You've got the quantity, which is maxed out to 100. But then beyond that, you've got direction. And so it becomes misdirected. In other words, it becomes directed towards the service of itself. Serves the mere idea or image of fairness in itself. Not the real thing, not the wholeness that it purports to represent. So that's another characteristic of evil, is that it is inherently deceptive because it's split. It must therefore be ironic and hypocritical. Because it has to hide certain things. Because it cannot exist in truth and in full understanding. Once you see it, it falls apart. It no longer affects you or harms you. So, fairness then, take it to its extreme. Total equity can be the greatest form of evil. Let's take something like discipline again. I come back to this quite often. So structure is a great quality to have. The structure of a workout routine or a work timetable or just general daily discipline. Great. We all need a bit of that. But you take that to its extreme, becomes rigid, sure. But what's the most rigid thing in the world? Well, evil can be pretty rigid, right? So can unreliability. So can unrigidity. Like complete flexibility can also be a kind of evil. But take structure to its complete extreme and become completely rigid beyond the point of just maximizing structure, past that point into self-insistence upon rigidity. This occurs through freedom and denial and all those defense mechanisms we discussed in the previous episode. It uses all of those defense mechanisms, which by now might actually be better called offense mechanisms, to insist upon rigidity to an almost infinite extent. And so that extreme rigidity is completely self-contradictory because it's actually completely unreliable. Right? It can't achieve anything meaningful because it's completely violating itself in the end. It might have most likely will have the semblance of achievement, productivity, whatever it might be, but it will fall down in all the ways that really matter. So again, it doesn't matter if we're talking about kindness here, like extreme kindness can be the perfect ruse for evil, and often is. Maybe that's just the flavor in which it turns up in today's world, but it's just like anything. If you ask someone who's really into efficiency and cares about building companies and generating revenue for the good of the world, what's more noble than that, right? I mean, you can't argue with that guy. Like, he's doing all the good things that he can, and he'll step all over you and abuse you and manipulate you in any way necessary to get that thing that he's deemed to be the right thing. And invariably that is some idea of self, some image, some symbol of wholeness, but it's not the real thing. And so he expresses that through status symbols and purchases and a public persona, so on and so forth. And inevitably will be very, very ruthless in that. Well, we often think of evil as very ruthless. It usually is some kind of ruthless because it's whatever the dark persona is unified by the fact that it's distant from the whole. It's distant from spirit, the total and ruling will, as Schelling describes it. So whatever thesis you come up with, if you're mapping out your own shadow map, or if you're working with me and we're doing this together, then take any idea to its extreme. If we look at your tarot birth chart and say you have a certain card, maybe it's the Page or the Princess of Swords, that can be inspiration for a shadow map. In its wholesome form, it might be incisive, curious, spontaneous, but take it to its absolute extreme, it becomes heedless, single-minded, maybe even pedantic. And then you take that another step further and you misdirect it, use it in service of itself, then pedantry becomes a weapon. Single-mindedness becomes a weapon. Intellect can most certainly be a weapon, pretending to be something else. And that's the thing with evil. There's always an irony at the heart of it. So in terms of a definition, because I don't know if I've got one here from Schelling, but in a nutshell, the definition of evil according to Schelling is the use of freedom to violate freedom. So wherever there is evil, there is freedom to do it, but there is also self-contradiction. And that's the ultimate self-contradiction, but it shows up in all kinds of other ways as well, all kinds of particular ways. And it always contains this kind of enantiodromic irony where the image of kindness is not kindness, right? The image of efficiency is not efficiency. And it cannot help but reveal its own contradiction if you just are willing to see it. And I want to end on this notion that unless it involves a willingness to see and call evil for what it is, it's not truly shadow work. There's many things you can do to work through your own contradictions, your own tension, and your own personality and character. But one way or another, it will lead you to an understanding of evil. Why? Quite simple. Because beyond simply understanding your own duality and the various flavors through which that turns up, there is a need to come to terms with the essence of ultimately what it is that makes them good and bad. What is it that moves them in the direction of wholeness? What does that even mean? Hegel had a lot to offer on this as well, because he talked about the rational nature of existence. This is not something that's imposed on existence from the outside. It's actually the only way existence can be in order for it to exist. It's the reason we have energy. It's the reason we have thermodynamics. It's the reason things make sense on some fundamental level. It's the reason why 1 + 1 is 2 and not 5. It has to be. There's a logic to the heart of it. Not only is there a logic to the heart of it, but there couldn't not be a logic. The mind would have no way of making sense of experience. And that same notion applies to morality itself. There is both contradiction and there's an ultimate non-contradiction. And evil is the point at which it becomes deliberately and willfully self-contradictory to an almost infinite extent. So at some point, this is where shadow work leads. Because unless you can actually differentiate between wholesome and unwholesome, it's not individuation. It's reliance on someone else to tell you, which is necessarily fixed and necessarily partial. And so ultimately, this is kind of like what it's all about. So without wanting to give the game away, I do think that the ultimate endpoint of all this is, and perhaps best defined as, a connection to spirit, a relationship with spirit itself. And it might be worth just mentioning that from the offset. If you're coaching someone in shadow work or undergoing shadow work, ultimately it is about that connection to self. And what self means is rationally self-determined freedom, completely in line with itself, both implicitly and explicitly, both in and for itself. So I hope I haven't just thrown you off there, but we're going to be talking more about this. We're going to be talking more about dissonance and evil in the next episode. So until then, I will thank you for your time and attention. By the way, I have a series of courses you can check out if you're interested on the Know Yourself program. There's the philosophy course, the active imagination course, 2 shadow work courses, that's inner and outer shadow work, and the Way of Individuation 7 Habits course. So if you'd like to do more of this in your own time, study some deeper content, then feel free to check that out at knowyourself.makeitconscious.com. But for now, thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.